Hey everybody, welcome to the live stream. It's been a while since we've done one on the channel, and so I thought this was a great topic. And fortunately, I have two subject matter experts who are joining me for this one, who should be familiar to regular viewers of the channel. First is Sal Mercogliano, who's the host of What's Going On with Shipping. Sal, great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
And secondly is retired Navy Commander Bryan McGrath. It's been some months since we had Bryan on. As you guys remember, Bryan hosts a substack called Conservative Wahoo. I will put the link to subscribe to that substack in the episode description. So if you're not subscribed, you should be. And his latest substack is dealing with this very topic that we're teeing up today. So Bryan, great to see you again.
Nice to see you, Ward. Thanks for having me.
So I'm exploring the far reaches of StreamYard here in terms of the Brady Bunch. Like I look at you, right? Like the Brady Bunch. Sal, we'll make you Alice. You be Alice. I'll be Timmy or whichever Brady it was. And okay, so Bryan already called me on my clash of teams here. This is just a celebration of spring training. And since I'm in the DC area, when it comes to baseball, you know, you got DC and Baltimore. Right. So actually, I'm in Annapolis, as most people know. It's sort of like in football. In years past, I'd root for the Redskins until they were no longer in it, and then I'd root for the Ravens. And because the Commanders are now pretty good, they kind of both went into the playoffs. In any case, and as Mrs. Mooch, who's working the gains of the moderation here, so you guys need to be on your best behavior, because if you get banned, we cannot help you. And she's, I can tell you, in a very anti-troll mood today. And then we have Wonder Dog Sailor on the couch behind us. And is Ingrid up here too? No. You may see Ingrid walk into the picture as well. So again, thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll flow in comments and questions as we can. But guys, let me start with an excerpt from President Trump's remarks to Congress a few days ago.
To boost our defense industrial base, we are also going to resurrect the American shipbuilding industry, including commercial shipbuilding and military shipbuilding. And for that purpose, I am announcing tonight that we will create a new Office of Shipbuilding in the White House and offer special tax incentives to bring this industry home to America where it belongs. We used to make so many ships. We don't make them anymore very much, but we're going to make them very fast, very soon.
Okay, very fast, very soon. We'll talk about the details of those statements. So I have here, guys, the fact sheet of the White House Executive Order. Let me tee it up here. So Trump-Vance administration prioritizing the revitalization of U.S. maritime industry to strengthen the nation's security and economy as part of their America First agenda. U.S. has always been a maritime nation, but today's China's shipbuilding sector has established a position of dominance in the global market through unfair non-market practices, creating over 200 times the capacity of the shipbuilding industry. And this is something we've discussed, particularly Bryan, you and I, in recent years. This is unacceptable. To address this problem, the White House is standing up an office of the National Security Council at the National Security Council to lead a whole-of-government effort to strengthen the maritime industrial base. Today, we're issuing an executive order calling on departments and agencies to first establish maritime opportunity zones to incentivize investment in maritime industrial and waterfront communities. Secondly, establish Maritime Security Trust Fund to basically fund this initiative. Third, utilize Defense Production Act 3 authorities to invest in U.S. commercial shipbuilding, shipping, infrastructure, and workforce development. Sal, I'll ask you what that means specifically. Apply 301 tariffs to cargo coming into the United States. Launch a 232 investigation into China's acts, policies, and practices targeting maritime things. Ensure cargo entering the U.S. from Canada and Mexico is treated the same as cargo entering U.S. ports. Enforcing the harbor maintenance tax on imported goods and applying applicable tariffs. And Bryan, you have some thoughts on how tariffs are going to impact this whole initiative. Utilize bilateral and multilateral alliances to advance Western interests by collectively pushing back against the China bad practices, establish shipbuilding incentives program, develop cargo preferences, favorable task policies, establish mariner training and education, direct a new Arctic strategy that identifies goals and objectives, invest in critical infrastructure abroad via the United States International Development Finance Cooperation, direct DOGE to review existing practices as they have been doing across many agencies, and everybody's very familiar with that, increase wages for nuclear shipyard workers, reform the U.S. government procurement process, good luck with that, to make America a better buyer and drive out more cost-effective methods and market predictability, establish U.S. strategic commercial fleet, goal of additional U.S. flag vessels, secure U.S. access to critical supply chains, and conduct a 45-day shipbuilding review. So, Sal, let me go to you first. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I was ecstatic if you watch my video on it. I always love when we can talk about shipbuilding. I heard about this beforehand. I mean, there was a lot of this was in the works. Looking at that EO, that executive order that's out there, it's very ambitious. I mean, one of the big concerns I have is whether or not the U.S. can pull together all these various threads into some sort of coherent entity. I mean, the EO talks about studies. It talks about bringing in different departments. It talks about a lot of different actions. You got to remember, we've got about 3-4 things going on here at the same time. You've got the SHIPS Act that's coming from Senator Kelly and Senator Young, that's out there, that's in Congress, that's being worked upon. At the same time, you've got the tariffs that we're going to talk about. Same time, you've got the U.S. Trade Representative who came out with the Section 301 report that's talking about imposing fees and costs on Chinese-owned, Chinese-built ships coming in and out of the United States. And now you have the creation of this Office of Shipbuilding with Jerry Hendricks in it, some other people in it. There's some, I do question some of the people that's in this office. There's connections to some lobby groups. I had hoped that they were going to create a separate Office of Shipbuilding, but it sounds like they're just reforming an office in the National Security Council into this. It's a lot. I mean, it's a lot. It's good. I think we need to be talking about it. I'm glad it made the State of the Union speech, but there's a lot of issues that are hanging out here. What's the unions? Where are the workers going to come from? You just had the president of CMA CGM, one of the largest shipping lines in the world, Rudolph Sade, come in and say he's going to reflag 20 ships into the U.S. registry. He's going to increase the size of the APL U.S. flag fleet from 10 to 30. That's tremendous. We need more crews. We need more personnel for that. We're still waiting to hear who's going to be the maritime administrator. I got an idea who it's going to be, but it's going to be a big question about what happens going forward. So I'm optimistic, but at the same time, I'm a realist. I also know how tough it is to get the boulder rolling. And this is something that's been sitting for 40, 50 years. The last piece of substantial merchant marine legislation we've had was the Merchant Marine Act of 1970. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Brian, you teed up some great stuff in your most recent Substack. Your thoughts?
Well, the first thing is that I defer entirely to Sal and his wisdom when it comes to the impact that this initiative could have on the commercial shipbuilding industry and the commercial maritime industry. I'm smart enough to really worry about one thing, and that's the Navy. I don't have the bandwidth to worry about the commercial maritime industry and the commercial shipbuilding industry. There is, in the discussion of making naval shipbuilding well, the suggestion that in order to do so, we have to make commercial shipbuilding well. I refer to it in my Substack as a neo-Mahanian idea. I'm just not sure it's true. We were able to maintain the world's most sophisticated military shipbuilding enterprises for 40 years, even after we walked away from commercial shipbuilding writ large. The problem wasn't that we walked away from commercial shipbuilding writ large. The problem is that we walked away from naval shipbuilding writ large. And so, having already walked away from commercial shipbuilding, which is something that is dubiously strategic. And I'm sure Sal will ably advocate for the advantages of having a robust commercial shipbuilding industry. We stopped building Navy ships in the numbers required to maintain an industrial base that could flex to new demand. And we have put aside the president's speech the other night. We have been flexing to build more ships, and we've had a very difficult time doing that.
So Brian, roughly what year did we stop? Look, let's frame that.
83. Sal knows better. I think 82 or 83.
81 is when you saw the drop off in commercial shipping. And I think Brian makes an excellent point. I think he's spot on. Is, from 81 to 2000, you were, living in the shadow of the 600 ship Navy. We were, shipbuilding was in the Navy. But what has killed us is the lack of both commercial and Navy shipbuilding. One or the other can sustain you, but not having either is what has killed us. And I think Brian hits it on the head, because we had the opinion that, okay, we can transition out of Navy public shipyards to private shipyards. The commercial industry can go overseas. That'll be fine. But as long as we're building a 600 ship Navy, we're good. But then we won the damn Cold War, and now we don't need a 600 ship Navy. We're down to 300, and that's just not enough without the commercial ships in there to sustain it. Now we find ourselves with shipbuilding on life support.
So some of the other unintended consequences of this initiative, Brian, that you point out in your Substack.
Yeah, labor. Sal mentioned the labor force. We don't have that many people. For decades, we have glorified the useless undergraduate degree and running up debt to achieve that degree at the expense of working with your hands, mechanics, air conditioning and refrigeration technicians, steel workers, pipe fitters, welders, you name it. We have deglamorized that work, and we are suffering in the maritime industrial base because we don't have enough of those people. Not only do we not have enough of them, but I think the workforce may not trust our political leaders and their desire to build more ships and provide more jobs in these industries, because they've watched politicians move from feast to famine over time, and there hasn't been a steady, predictable demand signal, at least in naval shipbuilding. That's going to take some time to build up. We've had a fairly constant demand of ships for 3 or 4 years now on the Navy side. I'm not sure that's been enough to incentivize people to come into the industry. I think we have to do some really inventive things. I like that the president talked about the tax credits. I'd like to see us find a way to use the tax code to incentivize people to move from one place in the country to another, where there are pockets in this country where we have a sufficient number of industrial workers. There are pockets where we don't have enough. We ought to try to find a way to use the market and to use the tax code to even those out a little bit. Over.
So Sal, a couple episodes ago, we were talking about the decrease in shipyards. And so let's review the math, of that. Coming out of World War II, we had dozens, and now we have basically 4, including where we're building the new frigate, Fincantieri, and HII, where we build destroyers and also aircraft carriers. So as the president was talking about, we're going to do it quick, and the superlatives associated, the adjectives associated with how this is going to go. What are the constraints? Brian just mentioned workforce, but how about how long it takes to stand up or retool a shipyard?
Yeah, I mean, you have shipyards that are really committed to Navy contracts. So, you look at Bath, you look at Groton Electric Boat, you look at Huntington Ingalls and Newport News, you look at Pascagoula, and look at NASCO, and those are your big kind of Navy shipyards. I mean, those are the ones that are really dedicated to building some sort of vessel for the U.S. Navy. For the commercial side, for deep draft vessels, you're really limited. I mean, you have Philly Shipyard, which is the old Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. They're right now finishing up the last of the 5 national security multi-mission vessels. Those are 5 commercial vessels built for the state maritime academies. They're getting ready to start construction on 3 container ships for Matson lines. These are going to be replacing some older ships in the Matson fleet. And NASCO in the past, which are building the John Lewis class oilers, have built commercial ships. So NASCO and Philly are really where you can build commercial ships. The big question is are you going to incentivize companies to come in and build U.S. vessels? Because they're going to be expensive. Right now, Matson, it's costing Matson $1 billion to build 3 vessels. If you built those in China, which again, heavily subsidizes both by direct, indirect methods, those vessels, you get a ship that is much cheaper from that. So you have to do something to offset. I'm with Brian. I think we need to do more tax incentives. I think we need more to do this. We need to offset a lot, do what China and Korea and Japan are forced to do to follow China, and do some more incentives. We should be giving tax incentives to haul cargo on U.S. flag vessels. Incentivize that, And again, what that does is starts increasing the base. Listen, I'm one of those professors who teach those useless undergrad degrees. And I tell my students all the time, I can get you a job right now, for a maritime union and other jobs for 6 figures. It's going to limit where your opportunities are 20, 30 years from now, but you can do great. And more importantly, you can go out with your degree and pay off your student loans very quickly. There are a lot of jobs that are out there. And I think we need to adapt the Mike Rose style of advocating for an industrial workforce that will, turn wrenches and do welding. And it's going to be slow. I mean, it's going to be slow, but it's going to be worse if we wait a few more years. And so I think now's the moment to try to do it. This is going to be something that's going to go beyond the Trump administration. My fear, obviously, is that whatever Trump does, the next administration undoes. And I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a process where we start seeing some building. I think the U.S. is going to have to really do what we did post World War II when we were with a glut of ships and there was really no need to build ships. The U.S. is going to have to basically under contract start building ships, lease them to commercial firms, and then sell them to get shipbuilding really going again. To kind of do the Apollo program for shipping and then phase it over to a SpaceX.
So we mentioned some of the personalities that are involved. USNI News tease up some names that I don't think you mentioned, Sal. Ian Bennett, who's a former Capitol Hill staffer, currently serving as special assistant to the president and senior director of maritime and industrial capacity, and Cameron Humphrey, another former Hill aide who is now the director of maritime and industrial capacity. So I'm not familiar with either of those guys, but those are the first names that will man this office in the White House. Brian, the other thing, you frame it as the good news, which you've already talked about. It is, as we've all agreed, it's good news that this is something that the Trump administration, President Trump himself, teed up in that speech. And you saw the standing O. So everybody's on board. That's part A. Part B is, let's just call it devil in the details. And this is what you frame in your Substack, Brian, as bad news and even worse news. But let's talk about the bad news now first, which is about the legislative and executive branch responsibility. So let's talk about the legislative branch in this process.
Yeah, Congress is utterly broken. We don't pass appropriations bills regularly and routinely on time. I have spent the weekend monitoring the current situation, which leads me to believe that the deal on the table is going to be a continuing resolution for the rest of the year. Unlike previous continuing resolutions, which pretty much locked by line number in a gigantic, massive federal budget, the levels of spending in at the previous year's level. This one is going to have something different, or at least it has something different in this iteration specific to the defense portion of it. And that is all those line numbers getting rolled up into a limited number of accounts. And so for the remainder of this year, Congress is going to walk away from its oversight responsibility. It will be saying to the Department of Defense, where we previously expected you to spend this much for this program, this much for this program, this much for this program, we are now going to give you this much money for this giant basket of things and trust that you're going to spend it responsibly. They very well may spend it responsibly. They very well may spend it the way you or I would wish them to do. But it's a step towards what a friend of mine referred to as a parliamentary system. Parliament has no oversight of the Ministry of Defense, or very little oversight. Parliament writ large has very little oversight of the Ministry of Defense. This is what civilian control, one of the factors of what civilian control of the military is. It is closely holding the purse strings in order to influence where that money goes. And for at least 6 months, Katie by the door, it's going to be a handful of accounts, and the Department of Defense will be able to spend that money where they want it to go.
And then you also point out that, this isn't the first time that a Trump administration has had shipbuilding initiatives. There was a number out there that was touted by people like Hugh Hewitt and others, and I want to say it was, what was it, 455 was the number, or was it 355?
Oh, it was 355. I think it was originally 355. Yeah.
All right, and we did 0 to nothing on reaching that goal. The other question is, as you framed it, Brian, if you give the Navy, a amount of money and say spend it, I'm not sure that the requirements side of the house would even know how to designate that money. So within the service, we're like, does that mean submarines? Does that mean more Ford-class aircraft carriers? Should we bring back, Tycho class cruisers, which, was arguably, as you've touted for years, and our good friend Elaine Luria touted for years on this channel, was a mistake to downsize that class. The one success story, as we're building LCS and DDG 1000 and so forth, we take the one lethal ship and squander the opportunity. So what's the shipbuilding plan look like, right? That's no minor question, which gets to your point about, okay, we've done it before where we don't have a macro strategy, but we still kind of need a plan. And that's what you say at the outro there. So what are we to do about that?
Yeah, we have had an ersatz maritime strategy for decades. It was one driven by the desire to be influential in a number of places in the world. In my view, that the minimum number is 3. And those 3 are Europe, the Middle East, and the Pacific. We have generally made noise about and attempted to build a Navy and maintain a Navy that was sufficient for that knitting, both the everyday global security and prosperity monitoring, and then the transition to war that would be made up of those ships that were already deployed and the rotation base that you had to service those 3 hubs. I think there's a giant hole in this, and we are 1/3. The Navy's 1/3 too small to fill 3 continuous and indefinite rotation hubs. We don't have anywhere near enough ships to do that. And this has been the basis of mine and others' advocacy for a larger Navy.
Well, we proved that during 2024, right? We gapped key AORs because of that fact.
I think the proof happens cyclically over and over again because we have maintained a Navy not sufficiently large enough to serve 2 hubs and tried to spread that peanut butter over 3. That's the history major math that I've done for years and years on why we're in such a bad situation. And I am not sure, as I look at this administration's approach to national security, that we really need to build. Because if we're going to walk away from Europe, which it appears to me we are doing, and if CENTCOM is an economy of force theater, which is something that Bridge Colby, our designated Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, has maintained, the Navy we have is sufficiently sized. It's not well maintained, and it needs more money for maintenance and modernization. But the size is probably not that bad for a 1.5 hub Navy, which is what I think their strategy suggests. It's not a 3-hub Navy. It's 1.5. And 300 ships should be plenty to carry out that strategy.
So here's a tweet that sort of addresses the strategic realities of our good friend Elbridge Colby's 1.5 theater strategy. So it's actually a guy commenting on a tweet, and it says, Ken Mori ... Taiwan is not an existential interest to the U.S., Elbridge tells Senate confirmation hearing, which is the drum he's been beating for years now. And so this guy points out, who either retweeted it, said, nearly everyone who says, quote, we must give Ukraine to Russia so we can focus on protecting Taiwan from China, end quote, would give Taiwan to China too, which you agree with.
There is I'm not saying this is Bridge Colby. I'm not saying this is some of the, the upper people in the administration, but I'm saying there are an awful lot of neo-isolationists hiding behind the put it all on red, we need to be ready for China strategy, who will run for the hills if it comes to a dust up with China. They just don't believe in powerful forward deployed naval forces as a vanguard for our national security and prosperity. They prefer to spend the money elsewhere. They think our rich allies are free riding, yada, yada, yada. Scratch a China, an all in on China person. Half the time you're going to find an isolationist.
Roger that. So, Sal, if I was the guy who could determine where a top line budget would go, I would accelerate, because obviously, and this is, I'm a homer in terms of carrier strike groups, right? I'm bullish. And as we prove on a daily basis, critics who say the era of carriers is over are wrong. Now, we need to iterate against the Chinese hypersonic threat. We are doing that, not fast enough, but there are some survivability concerns. But if you get, the AIM-174 developed, and you get the F-35 out there, and you work on FAXX and so forth and so on, and supplemented by drones, as Jerry's pointing out here, holds drones that would help protect the carriers. So what does that look like? We made some missteps with putting large amounts of money at classes of warships that didn't really fit. And it's like, build it and we'll figure it out down the road. That is a huge mistake. But aircraft carriers don't fall into that category. Obviously, the submarine fleet needs to be lethal and vital. And so that's Virginia class, that's Seawolf, that's, and we need to build them faster and better. Because that's the other thing about our current constraints. There's no shipyard that's building ships in an efficient manner. So what we got isn't working. And so now we're talking about we need to expand it, right? Because thinking cherries under the gun, HII, I can tell you that certain active duty 3 and 4 stars aren't loving those guys at the moment. And so it's like we're, even the shipyards that are resourced aren't best practicing, let's just say. So on the commercial side, if you were king for a day, what types of merchant ships do we need to build in numbers?
Well, I think number one, the reason shipyards are not being as efficient is because they don't have the contracts on a steady basis to ensure that kind of element. I think, even if you look at Virginia class, up at Electric Boat, we went from building 6 boats during the Cold War down to 1, in the early 2000s. Now we're back up to 2.5, trying to get to 3. That takes time to ramp up, and it takes time. And unfortunately, what you see is our production, our technical capabilities lag behind. And the only way you improve your production of ships is to build ships. It really is. I mean, it's an economy of scale. You have to be building ships to do it. I think in terms of the U.S., there's 2 types of ships we need to be building. We need to be building container ships, and we need to be building tankers right now. And then we also need roll-on, roll-off ships to replace our aging surge sea lift fleet. I did a tweet yesterday where I highlighted the age of the ships in the reserve fleet, and they're over 45 years old. So, I mean, we can start a 30-ship program building 10 tankers, 10 container ships, 10 roll-on, roll-off ships where you have a commonality of engines, commonality of parts, and start building them in yards like at Philly, at NASCO, and maybe one other one that we privately see opened up, a new yard that can advocate for new technologies. But what you need to do is 2 things. Is number one, you need to commit to building those ships. So that means contracts have to be let. There has to be a guarantee that you're going to build those vessels. And second, there has got to be cargo for those vessels. You don't build commercial ships unless there's cargo available. So there needs to be things done to ensure that there is U.S. cargo, either cargo preference or requirements to haul certain portions of cargo on U.S. ships. But, right now, what we're seeing is one of the things that's coming out of the U.S. Trade Representative's recommendation is that, hey, foreign lines may not call as at many East Coast ports as they were. You get a foreign flag Chinese-built container ship, it calls at 4 or 5 ports on the East Coast. Well, you just had a huge conference out in Long Beach where the president of Mediterranean Shipping, the other MSC, came out and said, hey, we might not come to 5 ports. We may go to 2, which means we're going to jam up 2 American ports with cargo. Well, then we may need feeder ships, smaller ships to haul that cargo to other ports, or we're going to have to put it on the highways and the rails, which can't handle that cargo. So, and in the meantime, until those ships are built, you may be able to reflag vessels in with a waiver to operate in the U.S. coastal trade. This is the problem that we have is it's great to have people who have legislative experience, who are staffers in these positions, but you really need people who can from day one hit the job running and propose things that start these shipyards going. Because I agree with Bryan intensely. Unless we're going to start building up to that 355 ships, which we're nowhere near doing, then the only thing left to go into the shipyards then is commercial. And we need to put that in there quicker rather than later.
So, Carrie, can you put that comment by Himmelganger back up there? So our good friend Himmelganger, one of my patrons in Norway, asked, can you please ask Sal to specify what sort of tankers? Oil, natural gas, what?
I think LNG tankers are going to be a stretch right now for the U.S. because we haven't built any since the 70s and 80s. I'd recommend standard tankers right now. We've got an issue with the phase out of double hull tankers because we started replacing them in the 1990s. So we can start with that. NASCO is building tankers. They've built what they call eco tankers. These are commercial tankers. In the past, you can put national defense features on them that allow them to receive fuel rigs from ships so that they can double as, console tankers. But I do think that LNG is the way. I think right now to haul liquefied natural gas in the United States, we need to waive parts of the Jones Act, which requires U.S. built ships to do the coastal trade, so that we can bring in some Korean, Japanese built. Because understand, Korean, Japan shipyards need help too. They're desperate because China is killing them. There's like a kind of a pre-World War I shipbuilding arms race out in East Asia right now between Japan, China, and Korea. And this is why Hanwei has bored into the Philly shipyard. It's why Japan is looking to build ships for the United States. We should capitalize on that. We shouldn't go all in because Japan and Korea are really close to China, and you really don't want to put all your shipbuilding within, missile range of China. But I think we need to come up with some innovative ways to get shipbuilding going again.
So, in fact, our other good friend Harry Lime asked previously that very question, Sal, which is what about partners like Korea and South Korea and China? So that this is the predicate of America first, build American, so forth and so on, that may make it too hard at some level, right? I mean, no American's going to argue with we should build domestically and we should, our workforce should thrive and so forth. Brian's got his cat. What's your cat's name, Brian? Who is that?
It's Miss Moppet.
Miss Moppet. All right. We've got all of our animals. Sal, you need to get a mascot in the field of view here.
I'm at work. I don't have my doodles with me. Sorry.
You can see sailors like conked out here. But the question about partnerships and reaching across national lines is one of that attitude of America first, but also what do tariffs do to the cost of building ships, since our domestic steel fabrication is does it even exist anymore? We depend on, wait for it, Canada for a lot of our raw materials and so forth. So how do tariffs factor into this initiative? It kind of seems like prima facie, we might have a left-hand, right-hand thing going on here. Let's build ships and do it fast. And oh, by the way, the tariffs make that kind of not a non-starter, but harder. What do you think about the tariffs piece? Sal?
Well, I think the tariffs are, again, Trump loves to throw things at the wall and see what sticks. And in many ways, I think he uses tariffs as the opening salvo of his kind of New York real estate lobbying, offers. And so he throws these things out. The tariffs scare everyone. I'm reading on the commercial side. There was just, again, this big, huge conference out in Long Beach called the TPM conference. And all this was happening in the midst of it. This is when the big ocean carriers, the big container lines set their rates for the year. So this was creating just havoc. Because nobody knows what this is going to do. You add the tariffs along with the U.S. Trade Representative's requirement for, taxing on Chinese-built ships. And you've got some, analysts out there talking about this is going to cost $300 billion. Nobody knows right now what it's going to do. What it's not going to do is stop trade going to the United States. It's just going to be more. The question is, whose profit does it bite into? Does it bite into the shippers or does it bite into the consumers? I always say the consumers because they're the ones who have the least influence on anything, and they're the ones who usually have to pay. So it's going to play a role. But again, at the same time, you hear these ocean carriers. You have the president of Mediterranean Shipping decrying this. You have Rudolph Sade getting on his private jet, flying to Washington, D.C., so that he could be in the Oval Office with President Trump and announce that he's reflagging 20 ships into the U.S. registry. So, these ocean carriers are entities unto their own. I've used the analogy before. They're more like the East India Company of the 1800s. They're entities, that exert a foreign policy because they're so big, and they're private, many of these companies. So I think the tariffs are the next element, but Trump tends to use tariffs not so much for economic policy, for political policy. And so he's trying to get something out of Canada and Mexico. If you look at the very first tariff statement, he was talking about border issues. That's why he was doing it. And if he can get better border issues, then maybe the tariffs go away, at least in the case of that. But he's already talking about reciprocal tariffs with the European Union. It's just, it's hard to read what's going to happen next year.
So, Brian, assuming that, obviously that this is a desire of the executive branch, and as we said, that we view that as a good thing. Focus is always the issue here is, okay, can we keep our eye on this particular prize? But as you point out, even with a White House office in this initiative, without Congress, without appropriated funds, no Buck Rogers. So whether this is maritime or U.S. Navy, Congress has got to swing into action here.
Absolutely. And I don't know what the path is for that to eventually happen. I see razor thin margins in the House. The Republican majority in the Senate is not that large. It's more meaningful because of the way the Senate works. But at the end of the day, I see sclerosis. I see indecision. And I see the opportunity for interbranch mischief that quite frankly doesn't sit well with me as a rock-ribbed political conservative whose concept of what I'm trying to conserve is the blessings of the Constitution, our form of divided limited government. I think that the degree to which the Congress continues to abrogate its duties to legislate, abrogate its duties to appropriate in favor of executive branch power. I don't care whether it's Biden exercising it or Trump exercising it. It is destabilizing what was a good and wholesome and well-working political balance. That is what has me worried.
To that point, EOs have effect. They get headlines, they start movement, but EOs do not appropriate funds. So if I'm HII or Fincantieri or General Dynamics or whomever, I'm not going to start to hire a workforce based on an EO, and so to your point, Sal, the thing that's missing here isn't a sort of immediate demand signal. It's a sustained demand signal, multi-year contracts, 10-year guarantees, things where people, to your point, Brian, early on, how do we get people to move from, Silicon Valley in the tech sector to Pascagoula, Mississippi? So put down your iPad and pick up a grease gun and a wrench, and you'll make great money. As you say, Sal, 6 digits, you'll be union protected, all the benefits therein, and we can guarantee you'll be employed for 10-year plus. Those are nice areas. A lot of, crime isn't bad. It's the Gulf Coast, all good. But absent that, nobody's going anywhere, right? And so this is no minor first step to get over or to initiate to get this thing going on.
No, I think you're right. I think the issue becomes, without, the bucks, it's a big problem. And, we're operating on a continuing resolution. We haven't been able to get budgets passed. And, this is my fear of this operating out of the NSC too, is that the NSC is going to be dealing with the crisis of the day. This is not, you need a long-term Office of Shipbuilding if you're going to do this. It needs to be over in either OMB, over in Commerce, over somewhere, not dealing with kind of the emergencies here. But, this is, Waltz is one of the big players behind this. He's one of the big advocates for the Ship for America Act. So, it comes out of his office for good reason. But, we need to be able to put a full face on this, and it's going to require a lot of work. I have huge respect for Jerry Hendricks. I think he's probably one of the smartest thinkers we have when it comes to naval, but his experience is naval. It's not really commercial, and you've got to be able to deal with shipyards. You got to be able to deal with unions. You got to be able to deal with shipping companies, because this is not all just naval. It's also commercial shipbuilding. And I worry sometimes, and Brian and I have had this conversation before, where you have maritime strategies, which are true maritime strategies that talk about, naval and commercial sides.
Well, and what you speak to there, Sal, is coherence across the administration. So who gets POTUS's ear at any given moment? And so you can have an all-star team, but if they're stovepiped, there's no whole of government approach that will yield effective decisions across the shipbuilding strategy. And it's sort of de rigueur these days to beat up Elon Musk. But he's like zero out the F-35, drones, and just look at what's happening in Ukraine. You don't need aircraft carriers, so forth and so on. So, okay, how does that, stream of consciousness translate into a shipbuilding program? And as you said, at NSC, what does Waltz want to do? What does Elbridge Colby want to do? How does this all sort of coalesce into choices made that are put into at the feet of Congress? And the other reality there, as we talk about inner service, you talk about, to use a bad word, a pork concerns. Obviously Roger Wicker and some others care a lot about shipbuilding because this is jobs in their districts, and are there other parts of America that bleed red, white, and blue, but really don't care about shipbuilding? There are other things that would benefit them greatly. So how does that play out? But we're not even at that level at this point. To your point, Brian, we're just trying to figure out, is Congress going to do their fiduciary fundamental responsibility within the Constitution at this point? That's the question. Start there, and then we can argue about who gets what along the way. So let's bring up some questions here, and I'll put up the all three at once view here.
Are you going to pull them up?
Well, do you have any you want to bring up?
I've been putting up ones I saw.
Okay. So let's bring up. So Treen Daly says, with kill switches on the F-35s, the Dutch may not want them now. So this speaks to something that Justin and I talked about, Justin Brockton and I talked about during the Ukraine episode we did a couple of days ago, which is, this is about the NATO construct. It's also about AUKUS, right? So that's Australia, New Zealand. That's the Far East Indo-PACOM version of NATO, which is more and more, maybe even of greater importance going forward, with China as the pacing threat. But if our allies don't trust us, because what it looks like, as we're just sort of looking at this sort of at a cursory fashion, it's like, okay, what happens if we pull out of Ukraine and the threat is such that our NATO allies want to use F-35s in that conflict, right? So how does that behave? So just for everybody's edification real quick here, the F-35 is basically like your iPhone in that you'll get pushed updates, right? You'll be like, oh, you want to do your update and it kills your phone for 10 minutes or whatever, but you don't know where it comes from. Who is it? Is it Tim Cook? Like, here, I'm going to give you an update, but we don't know. And generally it's about, security and other sorts of things. It's not a massive change, but that's how the F-35 behaves. The F-35 is in constant comms with every F-35 across, every military globally. And it's pushing updates, and it's taking all the sensor fusion, including when the Israelis bomb Iran, it gets all of that SAM data and then feeds it back into the EW suite. So this is all centered in Fort Worth, at Lockheed Martin, Fort Worth. So if we all of a sudden are like, we're out, and oh, by the way, American industry can't support that war in any fashion, so you can't buy more Patriot missiles, and the NATO standard ammo that is made in the United States is no longer part of it. These are the things that Justin points out. So to this question, to Treen's question, what does that do on anybody's desire to partner with us to build ships, right? Sal, that's kind of what you're talking about there.
Right. I mean, it's the issue of partnerships with Japan and Korea. I mean, if you look at it right now, China, Japan, Korea, they build 94% of the world's ships, but China is increasing demonstrably. I mean, if you go back to 2000, they built 5% of the world's ships. Today, they build, I think last year it was 51%. They have on the order book right now nearly 70% of all the world ships. I mean, China is going to become what Great Britain was in the 1900s when it came to shipbuilding. They're going to be the dominant player. They control not just ships, but they have one of the largest fleets with the Costco fleet. They have mariners. They control containers, port control. We see a lot of them out there. But there's a lot going on behind the scenes, too. We just saw that a Hong Kong company, Hutchinson, is divesting themselves of their overseas holdings. One of the big ones is in Panama, where they control the two ends of the port. So there's a lot going on here. And that's what I mean. This is not just about shipbuilding. This is about a lot of geopolitics. And one of the things that's really interesting is how this is playing out. I'm gonna have to apologize. I got to hop off here, guys. I got to run. There's an American tanker on fire off the coast of England. I got to do an interview. So
okay. Well, thanks for your time, Sal.
Collision today.
Brian and I'll we'll land this plane.
I appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Roger. See you, buddy. So OD says, refreshing to know there's a White House that cares again. So no argument there, right, Brian? This is what you said at the outset. That's your good, right?
Great. I'd like to see care turning into action. The White House cares about a lot of things, and some of those things will happen. I'm just not sure. I'm not sure there's enough support in the Congress. I'm not sure there's a good enough story, and I'm not sure that story is pushed hard enough by the president consistently. Yet, maybe he will. Maybe he will. I hope he does, because that's the only way it's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this isn't politics here. We're just talking about calling balls and strikes associated with creating an outcome, right? So we just heard the remarks before Congress, and both of us were like, "That is awesome, right? Good, and so no quarrel about the focus, and so but it's got to be sustained. It's got to be, it's got to have programmatics behind it. It's got to have Congress appropriating funds, or else it's nothing, and right now, as you've flagged rightly, we're concerned that that's a possibility, right? So here's another thing that Justin pointed out. Based on all of this churn around Ukraine, the beneficiary so far has been EU defense stocks are skyrocketing, as NATO has to sort of assess what's the world look like with America not in the lead, if not present at all in NATO. And again, as Justin, I highly recommend, if you haven't watched that episode, you do, because that's kind of, it's part of this conversation, which is the post-World War II order is U.S. led. The NATO construct is based on U.S. and U.S.'s guidance to our NATO partners that we've got the lead. So in some cases, don't worry about having nukes. You'll be under our nuclear umbrella. In other cases, it's like, you don't need to build frontline equipment. I need you to build an EW platform. I need you to build a tanker. I need you to build a cargo airplane, helicopters. And we got everything else with our, Eagles and Tomcats and whatever else. And now, if we're just like summarily, with the notable and questionable exception of F-35, where there's a whole lot of questions about kill switches and what does this mean, but suddenly there may be a shift where you're like, okay, now you guys take everything, including your industrial base, from scratch. So this is the question with respect to, can we go this alone? Is that the fastest path to get ships on the waterfront and ships underway? I don't know. We'll keep paying attention here and see how that would go. Let's do a couple more here, Brian. I don't want to do like political commentary. I want a real question. JK says, of course, logistics is essential, but your sharp point must have credibility for other than sandal-wearing opponents. Roger that.
I think our sharp point does have credibility. I think we have the most sophisticated and powerful combat forces on the face of the earth, and no one comes close. China is building a respectable Navy, but they're not there yet. I don't like the trends. I don't like the trends at all. And because they have the industrial capacity that they have and the ability to build faster than we do, they're turning inside of our aircraft carrier. I mean, and that's the analogy I think that works here. But in terms of the missiles, the ships, the airplanes, the sensors, the black programs, the stuff that we have on the tip of the spear is unmatched, and it is wonderful stuff. The trend is the problem, and the dysfunction in Washington will eventually impact tip of the spear readiness. It will. It cannot not impact that.
Yeah, roger that. So cohesion is the key. A cohesive, sustainable national foreign policy is mandatory here. So Bryan, thanks for spending some time with us today. It's been too long since we've had you on the channel. Please be well over there across the bay from me. I hope I see you in real life before too long. Thank you.
If I see you in real life, it's because I've crossed that bridge and I don't want to cross that bridge.
No, you don't. Especially the westbound span is hairier than the eastbound span. Have you ever noticed that? It's
Yes.
because you
Yes,
can
I
see
do.
through the railings, but
Right.
in any case. All right. Thank you, my friend.
Take care.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We've had a really nice crowd here. Remember, as soon as I sign off here, this becomes an episode on the channel. So if you missed something or if you want to come back and check out the comments you made, you can, and then add new comments as we normally do with produced episodes. But again, thank you. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you do not miss anything going forward, as I normally say. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you guys again very soon. Thanks again for being here.